3 days ago, I stood in my own kitchen while my daughter told me I had until Friday to find somewhere else to live. The coffee I had just made was still sitting on the counter getting cold. I didn't pick it up. I just stood there looking at her, this woman I had carried through every hard year of my life, and I thought, she actually means it. My name is Rosemary Aldridge, and I am 64 years old. I have lived in the same house in Knoxville, Tennessee for 31 years. I bought it when my daughter Cassie was 3 years old and her brother Miles had just turned 1. I bought it the same week my husband Gerald walked out of our lives without so much as a forwarding address. I bought it with money I had saved working double shifts at the county hospital, where I spent 28 years as a licensed practical nurse. I bought it because I needed my children to have one thing in their lives that couldn't be taken away. That house was that one thing. And then my daughter turned 42, inherited a sum of money from her father's estate that I didn't even know existed, and decided the house she grew up in would make a very nice rental property for her and her husband to manage together. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me ask you something first. Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized they are seeing you, not as a person, but as an obstacle? If this story already made something in your chest tighten, leave me a comment. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from too. I love knowing how far these stories travel, and if you stay until the end, I promise you this story does not end the way it started. I grew up in Greenville, a small town about an hour east of Knoxville. My own mother worked as a seamstress. My father drove a delivery truck for a hardware company until his back gave out when I was 12. We were not poor exactly, but we were careful. Every dollar had a purpose, and nothing was wasted. That upbringing stayed with me the way upbringings always do, whether you want them to or not. I married young. Too young, if I am honest with myself. Gerald was charming and restless, the kind of man who always had a plan that never quite worked out. We were happy for a few years, the way young couples are happy, before the real weight of life settles in. Then Cassie came along, and then Miles, and Gerald's restlessness turned into something else. Something I didn't have a name for at the time. He started staying out late. Then later. Then not coming home until I had already made breakfast and gotten the children dressed for the day. The morning he left, he didn't say goodbye to the kids. That is the thing I have never fully forgiven. Not leaving me. I understood that eventually. But he didn't say goodbye to a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old who wouldn't understand for years why their father had simply stopped existing. I didn't fall apart. I couldn't afford to. I picked up every shift the hospital offered, and I called my mother on Sunday evenings, and I cried exactly twice a year, once on my birthday and once on Christmas Eve after the children were asleep. Every other day, I just kept moving. Cassie was the serious one. Sharp, organized, always 2 steps ahead of whatever situation she was in. By the time she was in middle school, she was keeping a little notebook where she tracked the household grocery expenses and circled things she thought we could cut back on. I used to tease her about it. I called her my little CFO. She didn't think it was funny, but she would smile anyway. Miles was softer, more like me in temperament. He went into teaching, 2nd grade, over in Memphis. He called every week without fail, and he was the first person I called 3 days ago when the world came apart again. Cassie went into real estate. She was good at it, genuinely talented, and I was proud of her. She married a man named Preston, and I want to be careful here because I am trying to tell this story fairly. Preston was not a bad person, at least not at first. He was ambitious in the way Cassie was ambitious, and they fit together well in the early years. They flipped a few properties, built up a small portfolio, bought a nice house in a suburb north of Nashville. I visited when I could. We had Sunday dinners on holidays. We were not the closest mother and daughter in the world, but I thought we were solid. I thought we understood each other. I retired 3 years ago. My knees had been complaining for years, and my supervisor finally sat me down and said, "Rosemary, you have earned this, go home." So I did. I settled into the Knoxville house, tended my garden, joined a church choir, started doing some volunteer reading at the elementary school 2 mornings a week. It was quiet, but it was a good quiet. Gerald had been gone for almost 40 years. I had not spoken to him since Cassie was in high school. I knew he had remarried. I knew he had lived somewhere out in Arizona. I did not know, until 14 months ago, that he had done reasonably well for himself out there. Desert land, commercial properties, a storage facility business he had built with his second wife before she passed. I did not know any of this because Gerald and I had no reason to talk, and because Cassie had apparently been in contact with her father for years without telling me. I found out about Gerald's estate the same way I found out about most things in the last year of my life after the fact, and only because something had already gone wrong. Cassie called me on a Thursday evening. She sounded the way she always sounds when she wants something, careful and bright, the words arranged just so. She told me she had some news. She said her father had passed away in February. I said I was sorry, and I meant it, because whatever Gerald had been as a husband, he was still the father of my children. She said she appreciated that. Then she said the estate had taken a while to settle, but she and Miles had each inherited a portion of it. How much? I asked. She paused. About $240,000 each, she said. I told her I was happy for her, and I was. That kind of money could do real things for a person's life. What I did not know yet was what Cassie intended to do with her portion, or that Preston had already drawn up a plan before she even hung up the phone with me. The first sign was a visit I was not expecting. Cassie and Preston drove up from Nashville on a Saturday morning about 6 weeks after that phone call. They brought coffee and a box of those croissants from the bakery I like, and we sat in the kitchen the way we always had. Preston seemed especially cheerful, the kind of cheerful that feels like preparation. They asked how I was settling into retirement. They asked about the garden and the choir. They complimented the house, which they rarely did. Preston walked through the living room slowly, the way someone walks through a space they are mentally rearranging. I noticed. I always notice things. 30 years of nursing will do that to you. Before they left, Cassie mentioned, almost casually, that she and Preston had been looking at investment properties. She said the rental market in East Tennessee was strong. She said Knoxville in particular was growing fast. I said that sounded interesting. She said the location mattered a lot with rentals. Established neighborhood, good bones, close to things. I said yes, that made sense. And then they left, and I stood at the kitchen window watching their car back out of the driveway, and I had the first small knot of something uncomfortable in my stomach that I could not quite name. The second sign came a month later. Cassie started calling more frequently, which would have been lovely under different circumstances, but the conversations kept drifting. She would ask about my long-term plans. She would mention, gently, that the house required a lot of upkeep for one person. She would say things like, "Have you thought about one of those 55-plus communities, Mom? There are some really nice ones. You'd have people around you all the time." I told her I had people around me. I had my choir and my volunteers and my neighbor Bet, who came for coffee on Wednesday mornings and had for 15 years. She said she just worried about me being alone in such a big house. "It is not a big house," I said. "It has 3 bedrooms." She went quiet in a specific way that meant the conversation wasn't over, just postponed. The third sign came when Preston called me directly. He had never done that before. He said he wanted to run something by me, just informally, just to get my thoughts. He said he and Cassie had been crunching some numbers, and they had realized that if they could secure property in Knoxville in a certain price range, they could make the numbers work very well on a rental. He said, and I want to quote this as accurately as I can, he said, "Your house, Rosemary, is honestly in a sweet spot. Location, lot size, the way the market is trending." I said, "Preston, this is my home." He said, of course, and he laughed a little, and then he said, "We would take care of everything, obviously. We would set you up somewhere really comfortable, and Cassie wants you closer to Nashville anyway." I told him I would think about it. I had no intention of thinking about it. But something had shifted, and I could feel it. The visit that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon about 3 weeks later. I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the summer tomato plants when I heard the car in the driveway. Both of them again. No croissants this time. We sat in the living room. Preston had a folder. I recognized the folder because I had seen enough of those folders in enough hospital administrative meetings to know what a folder carried into a conversation usually meant. He opened it and set some papers on the coffee table. He said, "Cassie and I have been talking to a property consultant, and we've put together something we think is really fair." I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her hands. The papers were a purchase agreement. They wanted to buy the house from me. They had an offer prepared, which they said was at market value, and they had also prepared a relocation assistance document, which outlined how they would help me find and furnish an apartment in a 55-plus development in Brentwood, about 20 minutes from their house in Nashville. I read every word. I took my time. Preston started talking before I finished, but I held up one hand and he stopped. When I was done, I set the papers back on the table. I said, "I am not selling this house." Cassie finally looked up. "Mom," she said, "it's really a smart financial decision." I said, "For who?" Preston said, "For everyone. We'd all benefit." I said, "I have lived in this house for 31 years. I raised your wife in this house, Preston. I am not selling it so you can rent it to strangers." Cassie's voice changed then. It got the way it gets when she has made up her mind and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She said, "Mom, we've actually already spoken to a real estate attorney." She said, "Because Dad's estate settlement involved some joint property questions, they looked at the deed on this house too." She said, "There may be something we need to work through regarding the original financing and how some of that connected to Dad's assets back when you were married." I felt the room go cold. I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "It's complicated." She said Preston could explain it better. She said the attorney thought there might be grounds for a claim. I looked at my daughter and I did not recognize her face. I said, "Cassie, this is my house. I paid for it. Your father has been gone since you were 3 years old." She said, "I know, Mom. I know that, but the law is complicated and we just want to make sure everything is worked out properly." That was the language, worked out properly, as if I were a problem to be processed. They left that evening without resolving anything, and I sat in the kitchen for a long time after the headlights disappeared down the street. I did not cry. I was too angry to cry. 3 days later was when Cassie came back alone and stood in my kitchen and told me I had until Friday. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and I thought about every year I had spent in that house. I thought about the winter when the furnace broke and I slept with both children in the same bed to keep warm until I could get it fixed. I thought about the summer Miles broke his arm falling out of the backyard oak tree, and I drove him to the ER myself at 11 o'clock at night and came home and sat on the porch and shook for an hour after he was asleep. I thought about Cassie's senior prom dress hanging on the closet door, white with yellow flowers, and how proud I had been standing at the bottom of the stairs watching her come down. That house was not an asset. That house was the whole story of us. I picked up the phone and called Miles. He answered on the second ring the way he always does. I could hear the television in the background and then the sound of it going quiet. "Mom," he said, "what's wrong?" I told him everything. I told him about the folder and the papers and the real estate attorney and what Cassie had said about their father's estate and the deed. Miles was quiet through most of it. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "Mom, do you still have all your original paperwork on the house?" I said, "Of course I do." He said, "Get it out tonight." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I'm calling someone in the morning and we're going to need it." The someone Miles called was a woman named Carol Beatty, a property and estate attorney in Knoxville who had gone to church with Miles's wife's family for 20 years. Miles drove up from Memphis on Saturday morning. He sat at my kitchen table while I pulled out the accordion file I keep in the back of the hall closet, the one that holds the mortgage paperwork, the deed, the insurance documents, everything going back to when I first bought the house. Carol came to the house late Saturday afternoon. She was a small woman, maybe 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a directness about her that I appreciated immediately. She spread the documents across the kitchen table and read them with the same patience I had used on Preston's folder. After about 40 minutes, she took off her glasses and looked at me. She said, "Mrs. Aldridge, your name is the only name on this deed. It has been since the day you signed it. Your then-husband was not on the mortgage, not on the title, not named anywhere in the financing documents." I said, "That's what I thought." She said, "The claim Cassie's attorney may be suggesting would typically rely on marital property laws, but those only apply to property acquired during the marriage using marital funds." She asked, "Did you purchase this house before or after your husband left?" I said, 2 weeks after. She nodded. She said, "And the down payment?" I said, "It came from savings I had built up in my own account over the previous 3 years, from my nursing income." She nodded again. She said, "Then there is no legitimate legal claim here." She paused. She said, "What there may be is pressure." She said that sometimes people in Cassie's position, meaning people who have recently come into money and are looking for ways to expand, sometimes they hope the other party doesn't know their rights clearly enough to push back. Miles looked at me from across the table. I said, "She banked on me not knowing." Carol said, "It appears so." I thought about my daughter standing in my kitchen telling me I had until Friday. I thought about the carefully prepared folder. I thought about how many times over the past months the conversations had been arranged to sound casual when they were not casual at all. The croissants. The cheerfulness. The gentle questions about 55-plus communities. She had been planning this for a while. Carol said, "I can send a letter to Cassie's attorney on Monday. She said it would outline your clear legal ownership and put them on formal notice that any further claims would be contested." I said, "Please do that." Miles reached across the table and put his hand over mine. After Carol left, Miles and I sat on the back porch in the evening for a long time. The oak tree Miles had fallen out of was still there. It was bigger now than it had been in 1997. He said, "Mom, I had no idea she was doing this." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know how to feel about her right now." I said, "Neither do I." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be." And I meant it, not in the hollow way you say things you don't believe, but in the real way, the way that comes from having already survived harder things than this. Monday morning, Carol sent the letter. By Tuesday afternoon, Cassie's attorney had responded. By Wednesday, Cassie called me. Her voice was different. Not the bright, arranged voice from the kitchen. Something behind it had cracked open. She said, "Mom?" I said, "Cassie." There was a long pause. She said, "The attorney called." I said, "I know." She said, "I didn't think you would." She stopped. I waited. She said, "I thought you would just go along with it." I sat with that sentence for a moment. 31 years of nursing. 31 years in that house, 2 children raised alone, every furnace and broken arm and prom dress and late night and double shift, and my own daughter had looked at all of it and thought, "She'll just go along with it." I said, "Cassie, why didn't you just talk to me?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Preston said you'd say no." I said, "So you decided to push me out instead." She didn't answer. I said, "I would have listened. I would have sat down with you and talked about it honestly. I might still have said no, but I would have listened." She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Her voice had gotten very small. "I'm really sorry." I said, "I know you are." I said, "But I need you to understand something. That house is not a rental property. It is the place where I raised you, and I am not leaving it." She said, "I know." I said, "And I need you to understand that what you tried to do hurt me in a way that is going to take some time." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm not finished with you, Cassie. You're still my daughter. But I need some time." She said she understood. We hung up. I made myself a cup of coffee, and I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard, at the oak tree and the empty garden bed where the tomato plants had been, at the October afternoon light coming through the leaves. Miles called that evening to check on me. He asked what had happened with Cassie. I said she apologized. He said, "Do you believe her?" I said yes, but believing someone is sorry doesn't mean everything is fixed. He said, "No, it doesn't." He said, "Are you going to be okay?" I said, "Miles, I bought this house 2 weeks after your father left with 2 babies and $4,300 in a savings account. I have been okay through worse than this." He laughed a little, that small, relieved laugh that tells me he's been holding his breath. He said, "I love you, Mom." I said, "I love you too. Go home to your family. I want to tell you something, and I want to say it honestly, not because it makes a pretty ending, but because it is true. What happened with Cassie did not break my faith in her completely. She made a selfish choice, possibly guided by a husband who saw a number on a spreadsheet instead of a life that had been lived. She let that choice run further than it should have before she stopped it. Those things are real, and they have weight, and I am still carrying some of that weight even now. But I also know my daughter. I know the girl who kept a grocery notebook because she wanted to help. I know the woman who drove 4 hours in a snowstorm when I had emergency gallbladder surgery 3 years ago and slept in the hospital chair for 2 nights without complaining. People are complicated. Loving them doesn't mean excusing what they do, but it also doesn't always mean letting go. The house is mine. It has always been mine, and I am still in it. This past Sunday, I made a pot of chicken and dumplings because November is coming and November calls for chicken and dumplings. I set the table for 3. Miles drove up from Memphis with his wife and the kids, and we ate together in the kitchen, where I have eaten 1,000 meals over 31 years. Cassie didn't come. She's not ready yet, and I understand that. Shame takes longer to move through than anger does. But the chair was there if she wanted it. It always will be. Because that is what a home is. Not an asset, not a number on a spreadsheet, not a sweet spot in a trending market. A home is the place where the chair is always there and the light is always on, and no matter what has happened between you, the door still opens when you knock. I learned that a long time ago, raising 2 children alone in a house I paid for myself. I just needed my daughter to learn it too. I have been thinking about that accordion file in the back of my hall closet. 31 years of paperwork, rubber-banded and labeled in my own handwriting, sitting there in the dark because I was raised to keep records of things that matter. I never thought those papers would be the thing that saved my home, but they were. And I think about what would have happened if I had thrown them out the way people do when they're cleaning up and trying to make space. I think about that a lot. What happened between me and my daughter was not simple, and I don't want to pretend it was. Cassie did not wake up one morning and decide to be cruel. She made a series of small choices, each one a little further than the last, and she kept making them because no one stopped her early enough. That is how most harm works. It doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in croissants and careful questions and folders left on coffee tables. What I know is this: the outcome of those weeks came down to 3 things, and none of them were luck. The first was character. When Preston laid those papers on my table, I did not panic and I did not sign. I read every word and I said no. That came from somewhere deep and old in me, from years of knowing that the right thing is usually uncomfortable and that discomfort is not a reason to give in. My mother taught me that. 30 years of nursing reinforced it. You do the right thing, not because it's easy, but because you already know who you are, and you don't want to look back and find a stranger. The second was understanding my own situation clearly. I did not know property law, but I knew something was wrong, and I knew enough to find someone who did know it. Carol Beatty sat at my kitchen table and told me what I already suspected, that I owned my home outright and that the pressure being applied to me was designed to make me believe otherwise. Knowing your rights matters. Knowing when to ask for help matters more. I spent a lifetime in a profession where the difference between a good outcome and a bad one often came down to someone asking the right question at the right time. This was no different. The third was not quitting. When Cassie stood in my kitchen and told me I had until Friday, there was a version of me that could have just started packing. I was tired. I am 64 years old, and I have already survived more than most people know. It would have been easier in that moment to let go, but the truth is, I have never built anything worth having by letting go when things got hard. Not the career, not the house, not the children. You keep going because what you are protecting is real, and real things deserve to be fought for. Cassie apologized. I believe she meant it. I also believe that apology cost her something, which is what real apologies do. Whether we find our way back to what we used to be, I honestly don't know yet. What I know is that the chair is still at my table. That is all I can offer right now, and some days it is enough. If you are watching this and something about this story feels familiar, I want you to hear one thing. The deed to your life is in your name. Other people can try to claim it, but only if you let them convince you it isn't. Don't let them.